Evaluators love complexity. If you listen in on any conversation on Eval Talk or various discussion boards, invariably someone will say, oh, if only things were that simple. But they're lying. They don't want it to be that simple. And why would they want it to be simple? Because if the world is inextricably, impenetrably complex, then evaluators are like the alchemists of old. In the old days, I would bring my lead, and through some magic, the alchemist would turn it into gold. Well, today, the evaluator does the same thing. He takes our leaden program or our weak program, and through some magic of evaluation, gives us an impact. Now, I resisted this for a long time for two reasons. First and foremost, I didn't believe the world was that complex. For every wicked problem or so-called wicked problem, I thought there were 3 and 4 technical problems just dying to be solved if we only tried harder. Secondly, as an evaluator working at the CDC, I realized evaluation wasn't going to take off unless it was democratic. Everybody at every level needed to understand what it was and be able to do a modest amount of it and know how to deal with their evaluation findings. So my own journey towards complexity has been, first I used to ignore it or poo-poo it. Then I started resenting it, or at least resenting my colleagues for whom it seemed to be in full employment process. But then in the end, I learned to embrace it because from my high moral ground, I realized, you know, things don't work all that well, and things aren't working all the time. So enter realist evaluation, which allowed me to both embrace complexity and to keep evaluation democratic. So realist evaluation says, yes, you're right, the world is absolutely as complex as we think it is, but the good news is that we can unravel that complexity, we can do it in a systematic way, and we do it, we know how to address it. So it makes complexity simple. And in the process of doing that, what it means is that you and I, as mere mortals, can do this without the intervention of an alchemist or the intervention of a priest, right? Now, okay? Now, the basic principles of realist evaluation are so simple, but I'm going to show you that they actually do a judo flip on the way we typically think of cause and effect. So realist evaluation says, what I'm looking for is what works, for whom, how, and in what circumstances. Well, of course, that glides off the tongue. But it does a judo flip on how we usually look at cause and effect. So the traditional way of looking at cause and effect, here's a logic model, and I love logic models, as people who know me will know. I try an activity, I look for an outcome. If I don't get my outcome, I might peek behind the curtain and take a look at, am I doing the activity correctly? Are there barriers in the larger, what we call the moderating environment, getting in my way? But at the end of that, I'll identify what I call a best practice, and I'll promote that best practice. And what I will do is put all my resources into fidelity. Do that best practice correctly, and you too should be able to get gold. And when people don't get gold in their particular context, it's because they're doing something incorrectly. Realist evaluators take a very, very different approach. And they say, if you want to figure out your best practices, don't just look at your successes, look also at your failures. That the devil lies in the detail of the variances. The differences are what we call generative. Now, they thicken the plot in 2 different ways. The first is this idea of mechanisms. So we see activities and we see outcomes, but the line between them is when the spacecraft goes behind the moon. Now, what's happening back behind the moon are these things called mechanisms. I feed activities, I feed information, I feed resources to somebody, and it triggers them or it doesn't trigger them to make a certain decision. And whether they're triggered or not depends upon those things down in box number 2. So the first thing a realist evaluator says is, boy, if I'm trying something and it's working variably, take a good look at who is reacting, what are they reacting to, how are they reacting. And almost always the difference is, and first off, realist evaluation says, and not only expect, but welcome and embrace the fact that not everyone is going to be triggered, not everyone is going to react. And the answer typically lies in the second plot thickening mechanism, which is context. Now again, evaluators like me have always paid attention to context. That bottom box that we call moderators is a big part of how I teach evaluation and planning at CDC. But realist evaluation takes it to another level. And it says, you know, context is pretty complex. Context is layered into what we call the 4 I's. Infrastructure, institutional, interpersonal, and individual context. And you could have in a given situation something going on contextually in every one of those or just some of those, and that's going to be the explanation for why are certain people triggered in certain contexts and not others. Now, combining those 2 things, mechanisms and context, means that realist evaluation doesn't come up with a panacea, it doesn't come up with a solution, it doesn't come up with a best practice. It comes up with a solution set. So the conclusions of realist evaluation generally look like this. In this context, this will trigger this kind of reaction, which will lead to that kind of outcome. In this other context, this will trigger some different reaction, which may lead to a different outcome, right? Now, the beauty of how this turns into a solution set is what we call the infinite game. So one thing evaluators that use a realist approach do is they start and they end with their program theory, their program logic, their theory of change, whatever you want to call it, right? But it's always dynamic. It's never static. I start off with a theory. It's a best guess. It's what I observe from the world or the literature or whatever. I test it. I throw it out there. I realize I bat about 300. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes it's in the middle. I start analyzing, and then I wind down around to program design again. And I keep doing this. It's not an infinite loop. That sounds too daunting, but it's a continuous loop. So let me offer 3 cases, and I've simplified each one of them just for purposes of time today. But I'll show in each case what a traditional approach would look like and how a realist evaluation would put us on the road to success. So the first example is a typical HR solution. This one happens to be in healthcare and happens to be in a global setting. So in this case, the mechanism we were trying to trigger is what we call perceived organizational support. And that was believed, and the literature proves that that ends up being a big driver for why employees are satisfied, why they're productive, and why that leads to the organizational outcomes we're looking for. And in this case, we said, or the client said, I want to trigger perceived organizational support through this thing called high commitment management, or high commitment HR. Right? Now, in a traditional approach, what I would do if that seemed to work or seemed to make sense from the literature is I would write a book called The High Commitment Manager. I would make all of my managers buy it, make them read it, and make them apply it on the job. And what I would find typically is it would work well in a third of the places, it would crash and burn in a third of the places, and it would be middling in the other third. So, realist evaluation to the rescue, context plus mechanism equals outcomes. What would we learn from examining the context? Well, it turns out there's a whole bunch of stuff going at each one of these levels. So at the infrastructure and institutional level, there's how much I pay you. There's also how much autonomy I give you, and also how much of a sense or how much actual job security you have. At the interpersonal level, there's this other factor called perceived supervisor support. So not does the organization support me, but does my supervisor support me? Now, the traditional approach would say, okay, just throw all those things into the bucket as well, make them appendices 3, 4, and 5 to the book, and we'll have it solved. But the reality is much more complex, which is that these things interact. And this is the beauty of realist evaluation, this idea of a solution set. So it turns out if job security is high, I don't really care if my supervisor likes me. I care more about what I'm paid and how much autonomy I have. When job security is low, I could bolt the organization, but I'll stay, I'll continue to perform, I'll continue to be loyal to my organization so long as perceived supervisor support is very high. My supervisor has my back, especially in these conditions of uncertainty, right? Now, that sounds daunting and complicating in some ways, but realize how empowering it is. High commitment management is going to get me what I need about a third of the time, never going to get me what I need a third of the time, and get me sort of a middling job in the middle of it. By varying these contexts so that this management approach is tailored to the situation I'm in and the context regarding pay, autonomy, and job security means I have a chance to bat 1,000. Here's another example. So policy is a huge lever that we use in public health, and increasingly so, and very effectively. And the goal of any policy, obviously, is first of all, get the darn thing enacted, then get it enforced, and that's why the magic of public health will happen because of behavior change or system change or whatever. And a traditional approach would say, if I land on a good comprehensive policy, meaning one that works in 5 or 6 states that have been early adopters, then fidelity. Try this, try this, try this, and it ought to work. And what I'll find is a third, a third, a third. In a third, it'll work great. In a third, it'll actually make things worse. And the third will be somewhere in the middle. Realist evaluation to the rescue. What's going on here? Again, there's things going on at each level of context, and it doesn't mean I need to throw all of these resources at the puzzle. It means that I need to unravel the situation in any context to understand whether that policy is going to trigger the response I want. So these things are really, really obvious. So infrastructure is going to include, do I have resources? Well, first off, institutionally, I'm going to ask myself, do I have an organized opposition? If I do, and in this case we're looking at a policy for banning smoking in vehicles with children in them, a policy that's been adopted in several states, not worked as well in some other states. So first off, I'm going to look at, is there an organized opposition? Secondly, infrastructurally, I'm going to ask, how many resources do I have to mobilize against that opposition? And how many resources do I have to enforce the policy if I'm fortunate enough to get it enacted? And then finally, there's this thing called social norms. Well, the social norm piece ends up being pretty definitive. I can throw all the resources I have at enforcement, and if the enforcer, i.e. the cop, isn't supportive of the policy, it's not going to matter. I'm not going to see compliance, right? If the policeman says, gosh darn it, for all the murder rates we have in this town, I'm not going to worry about X, Y, and Z nuisance policy. By contrast, if social norms are very, very supportive, then even when I don't have a lot of resources to throw at enforcement, and I don't have a lot of resources to mobilize against my opposition, the policy will sing and I'll get compliance much more easily. So there may have been a day where I buckled my kid up because I was afraid the cops would put me in jail if I didn't, right? But those days are long gone, and now I buckle my kid up as a second thought, as I'm sure you do as well. And not only that, the most important thing is I look askance and consider them bad parents when people don't buckle up their kid in their car. Okay, so you can see how that context changes so much, whether that policy, which may look the same, is or is not going to trigger the response that we want. Last example, something dear to my heart, TA and training, which I do a lot of. The triggering mechanism here is I'm going to do something that's going to trigger change in knowledge, attitude, and belief and skills. And the traditional approach would be content, content, content. If the content's strong, the content is precise, the content is clear, then it ought to trigger that response. And of course, I run into the same problem you all do, which is, why the heck doesn't everyone take my advice? It's so doggone good, right? Realist evaluation to the rescue. Turns out in this case, we've got something going on in several layers of context that if we understood it from the start and messed with our intervention, i.e. our training and TA accordingly, we would get a much better batting average. So in this case, at the infrastructural level, there's obviously how many resources do I have to implement it. At the individual level, I've got two big things: the learning style of the person who's being victimized by my training and their sense of self-efficacy. At the interpersonal level, and this was a revelation to me, but not a surprising one, the interpersonal level, there's this issue of who is doing the training. So back when I was with a consulting firm, we did a great favor for humanity and offered free training to all the United Way organizations in Atlanta. And almost no one took us up on that option. Even though we were really good trainers, we had lots to say, we were very informed on the issues they were dealing with. Why? Because they thought we were working for the man, and they thought the peek behind the curtain would end up reporting them to the funder, and the funder would find out something they didn't want to find out. The biggest thing, though, is scope of duty. So I can go in there and I can teach you all you need to know to change problem X, Y, and Z. If your scope of duties is that, no, I can't change that by myself, I can only change it when I get the kindness of strangers and friends mobilized, then unless my training and my TA have paid a lot of attention to how to make those collaborations happen, nothing's really going to take. By contrast, in a rural environment, I don't have to worry about teams. The same poor guy is probably the mayor, the police chief, and the school superintendent. So there's no problem about collaborating teams. He can do it at dinner, right? But the reality is there, the issue is, my God, I got so much to do. How do I prioritize? How do I make decisions? And especially, how do I look for leveraging connections among those various roles? Right? So all of this can seem really, really depressing. And when you first experience complexity, it can be very depressing. But a realist says, no, complexity is your friend. In fact, complexity is your BFF, because once you unravel the elements of it, it helps you understand how to improve your batting average. Why? Because it makes you accept from the start things are not always going to work the same way with all my targets. Secondly, things, even when the same target is in play, are not going to work in all contexts. I don't have a solution, I have a set of solutions. I have a solution set. The reason I'm going to come to that is this idea of iteration, not expecting success all at once, but actually expecting a mixed success and diving behind those near successes and those non-successes to see what more I can learn about when things work and when they don't. And as a result, I end up with a nice inventory of approaches that can be right fit to function, fit to the situation, which in turn will increase my batting average. If you do what I said, then from the start, you'll be able to embrace complexity and see it as your friend, as opposed to, as I did for so long, see it as something that either didn't exist or was an attempt by my colleagues to keep their paychecks. Thank you.